I'm Caroline Poland, the founder and CEO of Poland and Associates Consulting. And today we're going to dive into one of my favorite topics, which is trauma-informed workplaces and living a trauma-informed life. The reality is that trauma touches all of us, whether we're talking about big T trauma or we're talking about little t trauma. And certainly, especially with this COVID-19 pandemic, we've all experienced traumatic events. So the reality is, like I said, trauma touches each of our lives, and that means that it impacts the workplace, it impacts the classroom, it impacts our connections, and of course it impacts ourselves and our own bodies. So today we're going to dive more into this series, and we're going to talk a little bit about the why. So before we can jump in and really talk about the principles and integration of trauma-informed care into workplaces and classrooms and just living a trauma-informed life in general, I think we really need to understand and kind of build that foundation of why it's so important to do so, and then we'll get into the how of how to do that. I do want to mention I have a disclaimer below, but this is really just a very general kind of scratching the surface conversation, and so I'm really not giving any specific information to any individual situation or person, but what I'd like to do is invite curiosity into this conversation. So as you listen to this series, see if you can take that stance of a curious observer and a curious noticer of your own life, of your own relationships, of your own workplaces, and just be curious about where things could be switched a little bit, where things could be better, and how things could become a little bit more trauma-informed. So let's start looking at this basic framework for trauma-informed workplaces and living a trauma-informed life. And I want to start this conversation by mentioning the biology of trauma and how trauma impacts our nervous system, how it impacts us physiologically. And I have a whole playlist on that, so I'm not going to go through all of that right now. I'm just going to link that above, but you can go if you're interested and understand, again, just kind of a surface level explanation for how trauma actually doesn't just exist in our thinking patterns or in our emotions, but it really is stored in our body, and it fundamentally changes how we move through life, how we engage with the world, how we perceive things, and how our nervous system is functioning. And so really when we're talking about a trauma-informed approach, part of what we're talking about is a brain-informed approach to how we're structuring our classrooms or our organizations or businesses or our relationships. And I think when we can do that, it starts to normalize certain things that we're going to talk about through this series. It's going to normalize that fight, flight, freeze response, and really increase the compassion and the empathy that we have towards ourselves and to other people in our classrooms or organizations as they are also living through different experiences of trauma, whether in the past or in the present. So like I said, trauma is very much stored in our bodies, and I am going to share a quote by Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, and that's a great resource to dig into to learn more just about trauma in general and how that impacts the body. So again, that book is The Body Keeps the Score. And he says this: "We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think." So part of living a trauma-informed life, having trauma-informed relationships, and a trauma-informed workplace is beginning to understand how trauma impacts the body and how that plays out in the workplace, what that looks like in the classroom, what that looks like in our very life. Understanding that trauma doesn't just stay in the past, no matter how much we want it to, but trauma replays in the present over and over, where people can actually feel like that trauma is happening. That's what happens when we get triggered. So understanding that, and again, I will link that playlist above so you can go and watch that. That is really important. We also need to understand that trauma exists on many levels, and that impacts us and our relationships and our workplace. So trauma exists at an individual level. Trauma certainly exists at organizational levels. And of course, there's global trauma that then moves inward to impact the organization and the individual. So when we're talking about implementing trauma-informed care into workplaces or classrooms, we really need to look at it from multiple levels and multiple perspectives, and not just think about it as the individual, or not just think about it as the structure, but really to kind of look at this as a multi-level approach and look at the system as a whole and break down each part of the system in looking at how to implement these principles and pillars of trauma-informed care. So throughout this series, we're going to talk about some of these guiding principles and pillars of trauma-informed care, trauma-informed workplaces, and just living a trauma-informed life in general. We're going to talk about safety and connection and trustworthiness and choices and collaboration, and all of these different things that when we can kind of integrate them into the framework of our organization and how we interact from the top down and the bottom up within classrooms and workplaces, we're just going to really dive into that and talk about those things more in detail. So again, make sure that you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already so that you don't miss out on future videos, and just be really curious as you head into these next couple weeks. Start looking at your own life and your own organization and try to gain some awareness of how trauma-informed care principles are either playing out in your workplace, or what might need to change. What are some of those little adjustments along the way that could actually lead to a healthier workplace in general? You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Poland and Associates, and my website, polandandassociates.com. And if you're interested in having me speak to your business or organization, there's a form on my website that you can fill out so that we can begin working together.